My name is Becky, and I'm the director here at the museum. And if you haven't already signed the guest book, please make sure that you do that before you leave today. And we do have cookies and mints if you haven't picked those up, and water. And we want to thank our sponsor for this program, the Shenandoah Inn and Suites. Without the support of the community, we wouldn't be able to provide programs like this. We also want to thank Keegan's Cookies for the wonderful cookies. And thank you to our board for the supports and helping get this set up. And John Greenleaf is going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you everyone for coming. Needless to say, I'm pleasantly surprised at the turnout for this. I was nervous about it, but Shenandoah has once again proven me wrong, and that's fine and dandy. Just a brief history. I subscribe to IPR Digest. It's an email, Iowa Public Radio. And one evening, as I was getting ready to go to sleep, I was scrolling through it, and I saw one of the headlines, Shenandoah man retired Secret Service. Well, that woke me up. So I briefly read the article and listened to the interview, and I thought, I'm going to get this guy to come to Shenandoah. I didn't know where he lived or any history on him, except he was a native of Shenandoah. So thank God for Facebook. I was able to track him down through a classmate he has, Ron Ketchum. And within less than a day, we made contact. And so, as they say, the rest is history. So ladies and gentlemen, a man that served his country in more than one way, Mr. John Bay.
Thank you, John. Can everybody hear this okay? Is that all right? Thank you very much. It is my honor and my pleasure to be back home here. I've been in 108 foreign countries and cities, but Shenandoah is still my home. So I want to thank the board here and John and Marcy and everybody here for the invitation, and I'm most happy, my pleasure to be here. I want to thank also Dr. Carrie Nelson at the high school. Well, she's for all the schools. I had a wonderful meeting with her for 2+ hours, Friday morning I think it was, and we talked about school security. And she is really on board with enhancing all the schools here with the security as much as she can. And today, it's unfortunate that we have to spend so much time with that, but that's a fact of life. That's the real world today. And I want to thank Dr. Nelson for that. I was honored also to spend a couple of hours with the mentoring classes there. And those are good kids. They are really good kids. They came up to me after 2 hours, shook my hand and said, thank you for your service. And that is really, really appreciated. So that shows good parenting, good training at school, good community. So I thank them for that. We're going to talk about today. My neighbor saw that. Can everybody see that? My neighbor saw that picture, and along with a couple of other pictures that we're going to show here after a while, and she said, "Is that you?" Okay. Well, okay, that is me, yes. That was last year, by the way. Yeah. Okay, Tori, I think we'll have pictures a little bit later, okay? Okay. There you go. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about a journey. And the National Public Radio interview that I did was basically, how does a poor kid from a small town in southwest Iowa end up in the White House? Well, that was a journey. And that journey started here in Shenandoah with a wonderful education that I got from 5th grade on through high school. I went to the University of Iowa in Iowa City on a music scholarship. Graduated in 1967, went to Denver, Colorado to teach school. I had taught school for about 6 months, and I got a letter in the mail from Page County. And I remember who signed that letter, and I can see the signature like it was yesterday. It was John Gowing. He's a plumber. He was a plumber here. And he said, "Dear John, you have just won an all-expense-paid trip for the next 3 years to Southeast Asia." So that's what I did. When I out-processed at Fitzsimmons Army Hospital on a Friday afternoon, I had made application to 2 agencies. First, the FBI, and this was about a year before I out-processed. And I was accepted by the FBI. And a friend of mine, before that signed the final paper, a friend of mine got a hold of me and he said, "Whoa, wait a minute." He said, "You know, do you really want to work for Brand X?" And I said, "Well, that's a joke, by the way." Are there any retired FEB agents in here? No. He said, "You better look at the Secret Service." Well, I stopped the process. FBI had already done a background investigation on me. And they even found out about the time, and I was talking to Mr. Rexroth about this, even found out about the time when myself and about 25 other criminal 8th graders here jumped the fence at the swimming pool the day before it opened. And of course we got caught. And we washed fire trucks for a month. During my background investigation, of course, which takes about a year, the interviewer said, "Now what about this criminal charge, you know, and washing the fire trucks?" So that's how far back they go, and that's how thorough they are. So I started with the Secret Service, and in the Denver, Colorado field office, and you were on probation for about 2 years before they really let you do anything critical. Now we're going to talk a little bit about myths and misunderstandings about the Secret Service, who they are, what they do, and so forth. And I would encourage you, if you have a question at some point here when we're finished, that you ask that. I'd be happy to answer, keeping in mind that the answers that I give will be from my time. I retired in 1993. It's been, if my high school math serves me correctly, I think that's been 30 years ago. So it's been a few years since I've been there. Now the technology, of course, has changed in security. The technology has changed tremendously. But the principles of security are the same. They're exactly the same. So I was assigned to the White House. Then when I left Denver, I was assigned to the Presidential Protective Division. President Nixon was in office. He had signed an executive order because Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State at that time, did not want State Department security. He wanted Secret Service. So I was assigned to Henry Kissinger for about a year. And then back to the White House. I was there during the transition, and I'll call it a transition, between administrations, and was assigned to President Ford, and then eventually to the First Lady, Betty Ford. I was there through that administration and through half of the Carter administration. Then I was assigned to a field office because the Secret Service they wear 2 hats. One is protection, and that's what everybody knows because that's the most visible. But they also do criminal investigations. And in those days, counterfeit money, and it still is, but in those days, counterfeit money was a big, big problem. A big problem. I was assigned to Kansas City, and I worked undercover on the east side of Kansas City for 3 years. Then I went back to Washington, D.C. with the Reagan administration, and then back to Denver, Colorado, back to Grand Junction, to a one-man domicile office. There my territory was north to Wyoming. Now visualize this. One person, north to Wyoming, south to New Mexico, east to the Continental Divide, and west to Utah. Now why would they do that? Well, it's because in the wintertime, there were times that you could not get over Loveland Pass or through the tunnel, and every threat that is received by the Secret Service is investigated. Every threat. And there are lots of them. And you say, well, does one guy get more threats than the other? And the answer is no, not really. Because the threat is more against the office of the president than it is the president himself. So every threat had to be investigated, and there were times when, if there was not somebody assigned over to the West Slope, you could not get there. And every threat is investigated immediately. And it's up to the agent investigating to determine whether that threat is real. Is it some nut job, drunk in a bar, shooting off his mouth? Is it somebody that wanted to get a family member in trouble? Or is it something from somebody that has the capacity and the willingness to do it? So that assessment has to be made. Have there been made mistakes? Well, sure. And you know what I'm talking about. There were mistakes. One is called Sarah Jane Moore. Remember Squeaky Fromm? You remember that? Well, there are mistakes. And when mistakes are made, of course, there has to be, lots of examination on why they were made and what can be done better. Well, anyway, so I spent a lot of time there in D.C. I was in the Washington field office. I ran a desk there that assessed all the threat cases in the United States, or in the world, really, that the Secret Service got. And I assigned agents to go investigate those threats. I did not plan to retire in 1993. I wanted to work another 10 years, maybe 15 years if I could make it. And a partner and I, we were on Capitol Hill, and we were returning to the White House. And on the west side of the Capitol building in Washington is a big hill. You go down this big hill where you get down to Pennsylvania Avenue. Anyway, we were driving down the hill, and we saw over to our left a Capitol policeman that was just getting the tar beat out of him by this guy. And we looked around to see if he had any help coming. Didn't see anybody. So we said, well, we're going to stop and help this guy. So my partner's named Bigfoot because he had a size 17 shoe, was about 6'6" and 285. Anyway, we get out of the car, go to help. Come to find out this guy was on PCP, and he had unbelievable strength. And he proceeded to beat the tar out of the two of us. And it took a steel baton, extendable steel baton, to break both of his shoulder blades to get him down. And in the process, he tore the distal biceps muscle completely out of my right arm. They took me to, I looked at my arm and it was red and blue and black and all kinds of colors. They took me to GW Hospital. Surgeon got in there. After he got finished, after I came to, he said, well, he said, you know what? He said there wasn't enough left of that muscle to even attach it. So the short story is they gave me 1 year to rehab and to pass the test again. I didn't make it, so I retired. So since then, I've been doing private security consulting. I've worked for the Siemens Corporation many times. I've done security surveys for educational institutions, Ohio State, Nebraska. I did that for my cousin from Omaha over here. Notre Dame, and a bunch of others. And that's why I was very, very excited to hear Dr. Nelson that really had to prioritize security. And I may come back and help her with doing some security surveys at the schools here. So anyway, that's it in a nutshell. Secret Service was formed in 1865, just a few years before I was born. President Lincoln there was concerned about all the counterfeit currency in circulation. And he was afraid that the country would collapse because of all the counterfeit circulation. Now, you know, I used to be a school teacher. You know, I know there's some old school teachers around here. I'm going to ask some questions. And Judy, it's not fair, you can't answer. Why do you think that there was so much counterfeit currency in circulation back in the Civil War days? Any ideas?
Well, there were 2 or 3 currencies, weren't there? There were many currencies, like the South had one.
Oh, yes. Why were there many currencies? There were many currencies because every bank printed their own currency. What do you have, 3 or 4 banks here? Every bank printed their own currency, so people really didn't have any idea what real currency was supposed to look like. You know, there was so much in circulation, so your answer is right on point. But he was afraid, of course, that the country was going to collapse financially. It was not until 1901 that the Congress even thought about protecting the president. Now, I know some of you can answer this, but you remember what happened in 1901? Any ideas? Marcy, do you remember what happened in 1901? No. Yes, sir, in the back.
Grover Cleveland's assassination?
Well, there was an assassination, but it was William McKinley. Yeah, he was assassinated. It was not until then that anybody even thought about protecting the president. And I've been asked, well, you know, how could the Secret Service let President Lincoln get assassinated? Well, that wasn't, you know, there were 8 original agents working on counterfeit cases. So there was no legislation for protection of the president until 1901. And then it was very, very lax. There was very little funding. There was very little personnel assigned, very few personnel assigned. So it wasn't really serious. It was what I call window dressing. And that's what I tell people that want to do security surveys for their business, for their education institutions. And I tell them, I said, you know, if you want window dressing, you better find somebody else because it's going to waste your money. I'm not into window dressing. Security on any level means inconvenience. It means inconvenience. How much is the public willing to be inconvenienced? Does there have to be a halfway point? Sure. What is practical? When I moved to Iowa City, moved back to Iowa City, I was asked by the president of the university to sit down with one of his vice presidents. And they wanted to have my opinion of the security at sports venues, Kinnick Stadium, Carver Hawkeye Arena, and so forth. I gave him my opinion of the security. I never heard back one word from anybody. Didn't want to hear it. Security at Kinnick Stadium is that they have an 18-year-old young boy or young girl sit there and say, do you have anything in your pockets? You know, I've been tempted to say, well, I have a Smith & Wesson 45 in this pocket, and I've got a 6-hour 9mm in the other, and they probably say, yeah, okay, thanks. So that's security. That's not security. That's window dressing. That's window dressing. So I tell people, I'm really not interested in that. You know, you're wasting your money. You're wasting your money. So it was a I feel very blessed to have had the time in the Secret Service that I had. Now, the Secret Service is apolitical. If it ever becomes political, it will be the end of it. Is that my mom? No, I shouldn't say that. My mom and dad are resting comfortably up at Rose Hill, along with my sisters. Bless their soul.
Sorry.
Now, if I was a teacher, I'd have you removed down to the principal's office. Why is the Secret Service apolitical? They're not part of an administration. They're not Democrats, not Republicans, not independents. Why are they independent? Why are they apolitical? Any ideas?
For the good of the people.
Well, for the good of the people, but what would happen? See, administrations change. Political parties change. Sometimes there's Democrats, sometimes there's Republicans. Now, what would happen if, now for instance, I was at the White House detail during 5 different administrations, Democrats and Republicans. What would happen if Republican was in office, Democrat was elected? Then he'd say, I don't want any of these guys because I don't trust them because they were here with a Republican and I'm a Democrat. Let's have all new turnover. No, they have to have absolute trust in the people that are assigned there. So there is no party affiliation. And you know, we're all humans, everybody has their own beliefs and so forth. But that is not public. And the president has to have trust and rely on the fact that it doesn't matter what party he's affiliated with, that the men and the women that are assigned to him are going to be willing to give their life for him if it becomes necessary. And in some instances, it has become necessary. So that's why the Secret Service is apolitical. And as I said, if it ever becomes weaponized and political, then it will be the end of that agency. And it'll make me cry. Because we've had thousands of agents that have put in their life, sacrificed their life. When you sign up to be an agent, you'd better not be too interested in being home for birthdays, for soccer games, for Christmases. Do you know how many Christmases I spent at my home out of my 23 years? 2. So does it requires the same kind of sacrifice that a law enforcement officer has? Firemen, any first responders? They don't always get to be home on their kid's birthday or whatever. So it's a life, a dedicated life of sacrifice, but again, I don't know any agent that would trade it for anything else. Okay, Tori, we have some pictures here we want to show. Here is a picture of Nixon and Kissinger, and I'm sure you recognize this guy with the hair back here. That was taken in Berlin. Now, by the way, all of these pictures that you're going to see are official White House photographs. I have a lot more over here. They're either White House photographs or they've been taken from publications that have been published. So that was some of my days with Henry Kissinger. That was in Berlin. This was when I let Bob Hope and President Ford play golf with me. You can see that he's waving to somebody, of course, and that is me driving the golf cart in the back. But I will say that those were Bob Hope was a real gentleman. He was a great ambassador to our troops, to the military, and he was just a lot of fun. He was a lot of fun to be around. So that was one of the stints that I did with the President Ford's detail. Okay, down here on the bottom picture is basically the reason why I've had 3 knee operations. Running in street shoes. Now that is what is called the follow-up car. So Charlie Maddox over here, Steve Harrison. That's a follow-up car, and this was following a movement that we had. This was on a Sunday morning where the President and Mrs. Ford had gone to church. Now, you can see that Charlie and I are running alongside the car, and that's at about 15 miles an hour. And up here on the top, you can see, as my neighbor would say, well, I would have known you anywhere. It's a good shot of my backside. So anybody, I've been asked many times, what good is it to run beside that car? Why do you run beside that car? Any ideas? Allergy season, I'm going to take a drink here. You are most vulnerable to attack when you are arriving or when you're leaving. And that's why you see agents beside the doors of the cars. And now these limousines, of course, they will withstand about a 150 millimeter mortar shell, but still the protocol is that you protect the doors until they get up to a certain speed, and then you come back and you hopefully put the right foot down on the pavement before you get back in the car. Otherwise, you had a few people had their feet totally smashed by the weight of these cars. The limousine, and the press calls it the Beast. That's not a official name. That was something that some press made up. Weighs about 14,000 pounds. That's just a few more pounds than your Chevrolet or Ford or whatever. And these follow-up cars, those are Lincoln Continentals, they weigh about the same. All right. This, I don't know if you can see this, it's entitled the Fearsome Five. Now that's something that Mrs. Ford made up, because these are 4 of the main agents that were assigned to Mrs. Ford while President Ford was in office. Now my same neighbor, this is the picture, she looked at this and she said, "Are you in that picture?" Well, you know that was 1975. So yeah, I am in that picture. Slightly younger then, but anyway, Mrs. Ford, this was taken on board of Air Force One. Now normally, the First Lady's detail or any of the kids. Now keep in mind that protection is dictated by law. It is not something that is a decision that the Secret Service makes on who or how long people get protection. If you're interested in looking up the U.S. Code, it's 871. But it is all dictated by law, who gets protection. And it's not only the president, his immediate family, the vice president, immediate family, former presidents, heads of state. So the list becomes quite extensive. And it doesn't matter how old the child is. If the child is in the immediate family of the president, still gets protection, even if you're 55 years old. So it's all dictated by law. Mrs. Ford was a friend. Now you say, well, maybe that wasn't terribly professional, and maybe it wasn't. But she went through some tremendously challenging periods in her life. And we were there with her 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And you're human, you're not a robot. So do you become friends? Yeah, you do. We had times when the crowd for Mrs. Ford would be larger than the crowd for the president. So this was just the nucleus. Now normally the children's details or the First Lady details rotates after 1 year. And the purpose is that they don't want you to become too friendly, too emotionally attached. Mrs. Ford pleaded with the president, said, I don't want any rotation. I want these guys. I want these guys. So we stayed with her the entire time. Did not rotate. Now the emotional thing about that picture for me, personally, is that there's only one person in that picture that's still alive. And he's standing in front of you. One person. Stress, I think, takes a toll, a terrible toll, on everybody in that kind of a profession, whether you're a policeman, fireman, whatever. Stress is not your friend. It's not your friend. That's from Mrs. Ford. It says, we'll be thinking about you tomorrow, the President, Mrs. Ford. That was a card, and I put that in there just to express, to show you what fine, dignified, gracious people they were. And I'm not here as a political operative of any kind, but I happened to be assigned to the White House during that time. So I had a laminectomy done. I've had 3, by the way, but the first one was done when I was 36 years old at Sibley Hospital. And it was due to a skiing accident in Vail. And so I was airlifted back to Sibley Hospital in Washington, D.C. And I woke up the next morning and there was a doctor that came in and introduced himself, said, I've looked at your x-rays, and he said, there's no way that you're going to get by without having surgery. He said, your discs are absolutely destroyed, and I'm going to have to do surgery. Well, I looked at him and I said, have you done this before? He said, well, yes. He said, actually, I'm the neurosurgeon for the Washington Redskins. President Ford had called him. So these were the kind of people that we had there. And this was a card of flowers that I got from the President and Mrs. Ford. I'll be thinking about you tomorrow. The nurses, of course, thought it was a fraud. They thought this was all a forgery. They couldn't believe it. Oh, this was a Air Force One. A belated happy Valentine's Day to you, John. Many thanks, Mrs. Ford. I don't know. Must have forgotten to give her a Valentine or something. I don't know. Anyway, this is a very, very cherished picture that I have framed at my house. And that's too low there. You cannot read the inscription, but I'll read it to you if you're interested. If I can here, it says to John Bay, with deep appreciation for your dedication and many hours of devotion to your duties and your friendship that I shall always, always cherish. May all the best in life come your way. You deserve it, John. Fondly, Betty Ford. That is a picture that I absolutely treasure. Now, the picture that you saw me running beside the follow-up car, this was coming out of the church, and you'll see that I'm right behind Mrs. Ford there. But we were coming out of church on Sunday morning, and so this was a picture that's in a publication called The Working White House, published by the Washington Post. I have a copy of it here on the piano if you care to look at it. But that picture is from that publication. But that gives you an idea of, you see agents that are behind and surrounding the president. There were agents, of course, stationed across the street and in other places that you never see. It's kind of blurred. That's taken in Grand Junction, Colorado. And of course you can tell here, that's me. When the president and Mrs. Ford would go to their home in Vail, had to land in Grand Junction, Colorado, because that's the only airport close that would take Air Force One. So we had to drive then, or helicopter sometimes, to Vail from Grand Junction. So that shows you the agents riding on the back of the limousine there. These are just some of the baggage tags, a few of the hundreds that I have. This one is a top Republic of Germany, Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia. Down here it's Italy, Australia, Belgium, and Spain. I've been to 108 countries. 108. Most of which I would not care to go back to. One that I wanted to go back to was on my bucket list that will never happen, and that was Crimea. Crimea, I spent 3 weeks in Moscow and was assigned to do an advance over in Crimea for President Ford and President Brezhnev. They were going over to his summer home, which overlooks the Black Sea. And I literally fell in love with Crimea. It's very European. The people there are lovely. Very, very European and beautiful, beautiful area on the Black Sea. Anybody here grow tomatoes? Any tomato? Ever grow any black crims? Where did I hear a yes?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you know where the name came from? Crimea. Black Sea, Crimea, black crims. They're wonderful heritage tomatoes if you're into tomatoes like I am. Anyway, that's where it came from, the Black Sea. That's where they were first propagated. So that business card there says John Day, the White House, U.S. Secret Service. So that's just a sample of some of the baggage tags that you go on Air Force One when you travel to a foreign trip. Most of the time there's many stops, many countries that you go to. Ah, that must be a picture in my garage. Did you ever drive the Beast? Yes. I drove the Beast for a year. After I'd had my second laminectomy, they didn't feel very good about me standing post for hours at a time, so they sent me to driving school. And in motorcades, you see these motorcades, these tremendous motorcades that are like, 57 cars long. They just get worse and worse. But there's actually a security package in each of those motorcades. It consists of 4 cars. The police car that's in the lead, the dummy limousine, the limousine with the president in it. I didn't say the limousine had the dummy in it. I said the dummy limousine. Nobody knows which one the president is in, by the way. in the follow-up car, and then we have what we call a CAT team, Counter Assault Team. So if the motorcade is attacked, that package runs. They run right to the airport or wherever. You know, all of these things are pre-planned for weeks in advance. All of these routes, you know, where every hospital is, where every escape route is, it's all done down to the second. But anyway, that CAT team, their job is to stop and to fight. Now these guys are not all there. You know, they eat, you know, raw liver and, you know, sit around and grunt. You know, they're all agents, and they love to do that. You know, that's just, you know, they just love to do that. They love to train constantly. But anyway, their job is to stop and fight. The rest of us run, evacuate. So I drove the beast for about a year while I was recuperating with my back. We had a movement in London with President Carter, and he had a live arrival ceremony at 10 Downing Street, live, on live television. Well, I was in Washington, D.C. before the trip took place. I got a call from the advance agent, and again, there are advance agents that look at every detail weeks in advance of any trip. And he called and he said, I want you, he said, which car are you going to take on this trip? So I told him which limo it was going to be. He said, I want you to measure it, the width, 4 or 5 times. 4 or 5 times. I said, why? He said, when you get here, you'll find out. So I measured it, and measured it, and measured it. Called him, he said, okay, bring the car. We were going through the iron gates of 10 Downing Street. And President Carter said, Bay, how much clearance do we have on each side? I said, well, Mr. President, we have about 3/4 of an inch. And he said, I think most of that's on your side. So the beast, yeah, it's fun. Fun, doesn't stop on a dime. Has a double everything in it, every component has a component, a backup component, and a backup component. Weighs 14,000. 14,000. Sent me to Bondurant driving school in California. We got to do all kinds of crazy things. In those days, we were training on Camaros, going as fast as you can, doing a J-turn. You'd be surprised how fast you can go and still do a J-turn without turning over, or sometimes turning over. But anyway, it was fun to be a driver. All the drivers in that secure motorcade, those 4 cars with the exception of the police car, those are all agents. They're not chauffeurs, they are all agents that have been trained in driving school. That's just a baggage tag of mine. Just a close-up tag that you put on all of your luggage. It's great. Air Force One is wonderful. No TSA. All your luggage is handled for you. It's taken to your hotel. It's great. Anyway, that's just a typical baggage tag from an Air Force One trip. These are two of my badges. The one on the right here, that is one of the old original badges from the 1800s. Looks like a U.S. Marshal, something like that. The badge on the left is my retired badge, and that was changed, about 60 years ago. I like the one on the right better. Looks like Matt Dillon or something. Anyway, those are two of the Secret Service badges. Secret Service, by the way, has 2 divisions. as a uniform division and an agent division. I was an agent. The qualifications and the credentials are different. The uniform division, they protect property. Property. The agent, and they are in uniform. The agent division, they protect people. I wore a suit and a necktie for 30-some years. You'll notice that I'm not wearing a suit and a necktie. So, anyway, when you hear, and again, people say, well, I know somebody who's in the Secret Service. Did you know so-and-so? Well, the fact of it, there's lots of myths. Secret Service is not, they're not FBI rejects. They're not part of the CIA. They're not part of the State Department. Secret Service, until 9/11, was part of the Treasury Department. You say, well, why Treasury? Well, because the original intent was to combat counterfeiting. And it stayed in the Treasury Department until 9/11, at which time it was put into Homeland Security. Secret Service is a bureau. It's a law enforcement bureau of previously the Treasury Department, now Homeland Security. So do they have bosses? Yes. Yeah, they answer to either the Secretary of Treasury or the Secretary of Homeland Security. And sometimes they pull the strings, probably more often than I would personally like to see. But there's just a bureau like the FEBIs. They're bureaus of the Justice Department. Oh, that's this. That's this. I can't tell you the number of times that I went up to a house doing an investigation, knocked on the door, some guy would come to the door, I'd say, Mr. So-and-so, I'm Special Agent Bay from the United States Secret Service. He'd turn around and say, Marge, the FBI's here. No, Marge, the FBI is not here. So, lots of times, people get confused about agencies, and there's a whole bunch of agencies in Washington, D.C. that are involved in security. But there's only one involved in presidential, vice presidential security. Oh, how'd that get in there? Could you see that? That's my young 31-year-old son who's stationed at Fort Lewis McChord. The irony of that picture is that he's in Thailand training troops from Southeast Asia, working with troops from Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Japan. This was one of those man things, where, they say, oh, you don't want to do that? Ha, ha, ha. If you're a real man, you'll put this python around your neck. Well, anyway, that's Eric. And I asked him if he ever wanted to do that again. He said, no, not on your life. The irony is, another generation. I was in Southeast Asia, do I dare say killing people? God, this is nuts. He's in Southeast Asia training the same people, the same population that a generation before were killing. It's crazy. It's absolutely insane. But that's the world we live in. That's why I put that picture in there. It reminds me of history. I put a thing on Facebook last night Marcy, maybe you saw that. Shows some young Native American Indian girls, and I'm half Indian. Grandmother. And it says, history is not there to be changed. History is there to be learned from. And if that offends you, you'd better read this more than once. Because if we don't learn from history, then we're all doomed. So that's history. Eric's going to be back in a couple of weeks to come to the Iowa homecoming. And he wants to sit down. And he wants to talk about life. What I talked to these kids about the other day, a number of things, but basically, nobody owes you anything. You will have influences in your life, some good, some not so good, from parents, teachers, community members, but it is ultimately up to you to determine your success. And I asked him, what does success mean to you? What do you think the answer was? Money? Yep. Big house. Car. Stuff. I said, no. That's not right. Success will be determined and your success will be judged by how you treat other people. Do you treat the bus driver, John? Do you treat the people that sweep up the halls every night after you're out of here? Do you treat them the same as you do Mr. Christensen, your principal, or Dr. Nelson, your superintendent? Well, you'd better. You'd better learn to respect the feelings of everyone. So life is not a straight line. You will have twists and turns, you zigzag. But don't be afraid to fail. And then don't be afraid to pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and keep going. But success is not how much stuff you have. Is it what do you want to have written on your tombstone? If you end up in Rose Hill or somewhere else, what do you want to have written on your tombstone? He or she had a lot of stuff, or he or she left this world better than they found it. I said, I want the latter. I said, I live a very simple life. You can see the way I'm dressed. I lead a simple life, and that's what I prefer. But I prefer to leave this world better than I found it. And I think that's good advice for all of us, in my opinion.